Welcome to the 2024 West African Research Association's West Coast Regional Conference, organized in collaboration with the Center for African Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. This is the second edition of the West Coast Regional Conference. This conference took place June 10th through 11th to foster a vibrant network of scholars in the Western region of North America who do research and teach on West Africa. The conference took place online over 2 days. We are providing a video of the keynote presentation by Rochelle Jean-Baptiste. To learn about the other presentations, visit the conference website at bit.ly/WC_WARA24. We want to especially thank Paul de Moray and Mango Angar, who served as the online hosts over both days. Mango also prepared a playlist available on Tidal. You can find the playlist at bit.ly/WARA_playlist. This was a virtual event. We organized it in Berkeley and the East Bay. Hence, we want to recognize that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchun, the original landscape of the Quechua-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This region continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. It is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are still alive, remain flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities. We extend this recognition to all the indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the lands throughout the western regions of North America. The West African Research Association, or WARA, is a scholarly membership organization. WARA's mission is to foster the production and dissemination of current research on West Africa and the diaspora, to promote scholarly exchange among West African scholars and institutions and their counterparts in the U.S. and beyond, to provide U.S. audiences with accurate information on events and developments in West Africa, and to increase awareness of the critical place of West Africa in the global community. In 2021, WARA began organizing regional conferences in the United States, collaborating with African Studies centers around the country. To find out more, visit www.westafricanresearchassociation.org. Sylvia McCauley of the California State University at Northridge is the current WARA Board Vice President and incoming President. Jenny Parker serves as the Executive Director. Membership information for individuals and institutions can be found at www.westafricanresearchassociation.org. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Rochelle Jean-Baptiste. She is the Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden Family Professor of Feminist and Gender Studies, Professor of History and of African American Studies, and Faculty Director of the Program on Feminist and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Stanford University. Her undergraduate degree came from Bryn Mawr, her master's and PhD from Stanford University. Before returning to Stanford University as a professor, she was a professor at the University of Albany, University of Chicago, and spent 9 years at the University of California, Davis from 2015 to 2023. There, she was also the Associate Dean for the Education Abroad program and faculty director of the UC Study Center in France, Bordeaux, Lyon, and Paris, and Switzerland in Geneva. As a historian of 20th and 21st French West Africa and Equatorial Africa and the Atlantic world, she is dedicated to contributing to a more accurate and nuanced knowledge about African pasts. Her work goes beyond higher education and is illustrated in her work in K-12 education. For 4 years, for instance, she was the co-chair of the Advanced Placement World History Development Committee. She was also Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the King School in Connecticut. Her research interests include the histories of marriage and family law, gender and sexuality, racial thought and multiracial identities, urban history, and citizenship. Rachelle Jean-Baptiste is currently researching the history of women, slavery, and urban history in Haiti, where she was born, and the French-speaking Atlantic world. Her talk today, Odd Notions of Race, Multiracial Identities and the Configuration of Decolonization in Post-World War II West Africa, draws on her 2023 book, Multiracial Identities in Colonial French Africa, Race, Childhood, and Citizenship. Of this book, Stephanie Newell said it is a path-breaking book that expands the history of childhood and race in Africa and rethinks our methods for studying intimacy and emotions. We are extremely pleased to welcome Rachelle Jean-Baptiste as our keynote speaker today. Rachelle, the floor is yours.
A book that was published in 2023 called The Multiracial Identities in Colonial French Africa. All right, so let me start the slideshow, and can you all see my screen? I just want to make sure. Someone give me a thumbs up or something. Yes, can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's start from slideshow. Play from start here. All right. So this talk comes from this book that just came out last year. And as you know, any of you who've published books, it comes out and there's the kind of afterlife that it has afterwards. So I want to first take us to Saint Louis, Senegal, and talk about these terms that I have on the slide, which are indigène, citoyen. And in particular, I want to talk about this man that circled in the photo, and his name was Duguay Clédor. So the time is the 1930s in Saint Louis, Senegal. So between 1932 and 1934, one resident, this man right here in Saint Louis, which was the capital city of the colony of Senegal in French West Africa during the period of French colonial rule, wrote a series of letters to the colony's governor. And what Duguay Clédor implored is that the colonial state should assume the care of one particular child. And the child in question was a child by the name of Charles Jondot. And the reason why Clédor, who was a former mayor of Saint Louis, a person who was a French citizen, he claimed the reason why the French state should take care of this child is because the child was, quote, in his word, métis, that is multiracial. So the letters elaborate that Jondot was the child of an African woman from the region and a deceased Frenchman who had been teacher. So according to French law, the relationship was not a legal marriage, and therefore Jondot was what French law would call, quote, a natural or illegitimate child. And by being an illegitimate child, he was an indigène or a native, as is sometimes translated in English, and therefore was a colonial subject and had no legal rights to any kind of French social services. And his parentage was legally unknown. But Clédor claimed that there was a third category between these kind of binaries of indigène, citoyen, and white, black, and that this category was métis, and therefore should have access to rights. So what did this mean in this particular landscape? So between, over the course of the colonial period, as people like Karina Ray have written about, interracial sex, mainly between African women and European men, continued in spite of the increasing harshness with which colonial categories looked at these relationships. So over the course of French colonial rule, thousands of Métis children were born. And throughout these years, as my book claims, there was this constant struggle, if you will, or articulation by Métis that, again, there were these identities beyond the binaries, and this made it so that they should have access to French resources. So that was in Dakar. Now let me take you to another city in French-speaking Africa. So now we go to Libreville, Gabon. And here are some images that come, not just colonial postcards, which is what's the images on the left, but the other images are images that informants gave to me in terms of thinking about their lives and how they wanted to be portrayed. So first we were in Saint Louis in 1932. So Libreville, Gabon in 1934. In the town of Libreville in 1934, a self-identified Métis man, and this is not his photo, but I like to often think about what my subjects or historical actors look like. So perhaps he looked like this person in the photo on the right that is standing with the bicycle. So the name of this person was Joseph Gaston Walker Demine. And Demine had founded and was the president of an organization named the Amicale of Métis. The Amicale was composed of people who self-identified as Métis in that town. They had several goals. They decried that the vast majority of European fathers did not provide any kind of financial or social resources for their children, with most fathers having repatriated after a short stay in the colony. Demine demanded several things. He demanded the social and political recognition of certain rights for Métis. Yet he articulated a much more broad definition of who was Métis or multiracial than Clédor had in Saint Louis. So Clédor claimed rights for a child who was the direct child of an African woman and a European man. In Libreville, Walker Demine defined Métis who were rights bearers before the colonial state as based on their multiraciality, or those who were what I'm calling generational Métis. That is, those who were the children of a Métis parent, in addition to those who were the children of a European and African man. So it's this idea that one European ancestor made you perpetually Métis. So in Gabon, Métis tended to intermarry and viewed themselves as distinct from other African communities around them. And they demanded that the colonial state provide them with free education, access to French social rights, and also that they have this education segregated from Black children. Whereas in Dakar, Clédor was claiming for rights of Métis as well as all other African children. And so their justifications were a very kind of racially racist kind of dogma that their European lineage rendered them vulnerable to African diseases and African milieus. In addition, Walker Demine argued that all Métis should have access to French citizenship. So this is a second articulation of Métis. So we went from Saint Louis in 1932, Libreville in 1934, and now we're going to go back to Dakar, to Senegal, to Dakar, and the year is 1954. And these are some colonial postcards of Dakar at the time. And then in particular, I also just want to turn your attention to the image on the left, which is a photograph of a Métis man that I'm going to be talking about, and his mother and an aunt and a brother next to them. The photo in the middle is of the European man that he thinks was his father. And I will tell you later on that, in fact, declassified French documents from the 1960s confirm parentage. And yet this photo comes from the family that carried this photo for quite some time. And then the image on the very bottom is the logo of the association that I'm going to talk about next. So in 1954, in Dakar, Senegal, Nicolas Rigonneau, who again is this person pictured on the left-hand side in the photo that has the red background, referred to himself as Euro-African. And Euro-African was the term that he used to describe himself. And he founded an organization called the Union des Euro-Africains, or the Union of Euro-Africans of AOF, or Afrique Occidentale, or French West Africa, and this is their logo at the bottom. So he wrote a letter to colonial officials in 1954. His mother was from Dahomey and his father was from France, Rigonneau, right here again in the middle. His father had repatriated back to France after his birth in Dahomey and had not recognized him. Rigonneau wrote this letter accusing both the French colonial government and what was emerging to be the semi-independent, quote, Black Senegalese government alike of racism. And he accused them of racism for not recognizing Euro-African as a distinct identity for people such as he, who were born of a European father and an African parent. He demanded that the colonial state pay stipends to mothers so that women like his mother who were left bereft in raising children without any financial resources from fathers could afford to send their children to French schools and provide adequate living conditions. He also argued that all Euro-Africans should be granted French legal status or citizenship, and that mothers have the right to sue the French fathers for the legal declaration of patrimony. So he aimed for this organization that he had founded, the Union des Euro-Africains, to become an umbrella organization across the colonial divide of French West and French Equatorial Africa, and become a kind of a Pan-African or a Trans-African, again, to use Laurel Senley's word, organization for advocacy for Euro-Africans. So I'll stop sharing the screen right now so I can speak directly to you. And he also argued that Euro-Africans were, again, multiple identities. Euro-Africans, and that they were Métis and Black, African and European, white, French, European, all at once, and they would contribute to the betterment of all societies. So what is the meaning of these different locations across Equatorial and West Africa, and in different time periods from the 1930s through the 1950s? So I argue that from the different locations across French-speaking Africa, and also with different legal statuses in French Africa, Rigonneau, Demine, Clédor launched different articulations of multiracial identity, an assertion that these identities generated rights related to children and childhood, and citizens and citizenship in 20th century French-speaking colonial Africa. They accused African and French societies of inequities against multiracial peoples. And so following American sociologist Omni and Wynant, I call their articulations multiracial projects. And what these multiracial projects are is that they argued three assertions. One is that they belied the French notion of French rule as being, quote, color-lined. In fact, they challenged the asymmetrical racialized hierarchies of indigène and citoyen that were the proxies for race and the very foundations of French colonial rule. Secondly, these claims complicated the meanings of emerging and seemingly fixed and yet very fluid identities in this time period, the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and even early periods of the 1960s. Terms such as indigène, citoyen, African, and French, and European. What these claims demonstrate is the capaciousness of how processes of identity formation in Africa called into question the seemingly geographically, culturally, and racially bounded concepts of identity, both in African and European histories. Third, I argue that these articulations of multiracial identities demonstrated the complexities of racial identity thought and practice on the African continent itself, and how these conceptions articulated within and outside of the continent. So usually people talk about race in Africa, the ways in which colonialism, European colonial rule in the West racialized Africans. However, I argue for the need to think about not just race and Africa, but race in Africa. How African societies themselves articulated, debated racial identities, and in the process shaped global thought. So overall, what my book does and what I'm going to do in this talk is I trace the roots and routes of multiple articulations of multiracial identities and the contestations that resulted over how such identities made people who claim such identities rights-bearing subjects as children and as citizens before the colonial state, but also these intra-African contestations about racial identity. So in analyzing the expressions of multiracial thought, and multiracial praxis in French Africa, these stories deepen our understanding of how historical actors deployed changing ideas about race to shape contestations about lived experiences of race. The other thing that I argue, particularly as we get to the 1950s, there's this burgeoning historiography about the kind of unending march towards colonialism, which was much more complex than what we thought, and Africans, to use Adam Get-to-Choose term of world making, and thought about multiple worlds of what this world would look like. And so I also contribute to this literature itself. So first I want to turn to the question of citizenship, which is something that is becoming, if you will, a burgeoning topic within African studies. So for the most part, the French denied Africans, of multiracial Africans, the possibilities of gaining access to French citizenship. Yet a surprise occurred in the 1950s in that the French passed laws that allowed multiracial Africans to potentially apply for French citizenship. So I want to give you the sense of what this looked like in terms of how many multiracial people, and again, I'm looking at a very small population, people who numbered 3,500 to 5,000 people, depending on what measurements were used to define Métis, whether it was the direct children and or multi-generational Métis. But I argue that a very small number of people and articulations therefore demonstrate the complexities and new ways of thinking about being of emerging African identities and Euro-African identities. So these laws were passed in the 1930s in both French West and French Equatorial Africa that made it so that multiracial people could gain French citizenship based on these very murky laws of proving their Frenchness, which again was a proxy for proving their whiteness. And though the law said that proving Frenchness was based on things like culture, name, throughout colonial documents, I see all kinds of verbiage about colorism, hair texture, various ways in which people are trying to define race by biological markers and also moral entities. But because I'm more interested in how multiracial peoples saw themselves, I read the documents for their own sense of self. So for French Equatorial Africa, the record is very thin because there's so many records that have disappeared. I was only able to find a 1-year time period of court cases for people who had applied for citizenship, and it doesn't mean that more people did not. But I can tell you that for this 1-year period, I was able to find record approximately 177 people out of an approximate population of 2,500 applied for French citizenship across Gabon, Congo, Chad, and what was called at the time Ubangi-Chari. So of these 177 people, 113 people, this is the very bottom line of this chart, 113 people completed submitted complete dossiers. 99 people completed the entire legal process. I can answer more in the Q&A about this very legal process that involved a lot of twists and turns and insistence and ways in which the French perpetually tried to stymie people's abilities to gain French citizenship. So over this one period, approximately 93%, a little over half people actually gained the recognition of French citizenship. So that's French Equatorial Africa. And in French West Africa, the picture was much different in that the archives there are so much richer, much more has survived the record, if you will. So I found that in French West Africa, with this chart, I found approximately 7 years of records from 1931 to 1938. And again, because any of you who've done research in kind of colonial archives will know that there are many missing documents, so it's hard to know, was this the full picture of the number of people who applied? Were some records lost? That I will not know, but I can tell you that these are the records that prove just how many people whose dossiers actually made their way to the Court of Appeals, which was located in Dakar for French West Africa, and then in Brazzaville for French Equatorial Africa. So in 1931, in the first column, approximately 15 people applied across all of the colonies. And in total, over a 6-year period, about 139 people applied and got citizenship. But what's more interesting in these court records is less about the kind of legal fourways, if you will, than the ways in which people wrote narratives, if you will, narratives in which they were self-fashioning their identities and claiming for themselves this Frenchness in spite of kind of French prescriptions, where you really see these kind of multi-racial African identities in becoming, if you will, through these narratives and letters of self-fashioning. So to a certain extent, what I argue is that multiracial Africans took the very tools of colonialism, pen, paper, access to French education, the French language, and narrated these letters where they claimed a sense of Frenchness. So I'll just tell you some of these narratives that I read in the archives. So for example, in 1937, a man named Frédéric Carl D, and DIT is the term that was before their surname. DIT, the translation is English is otherwise known as, because the French had laws in which they did not ever want to codify a European last name for someone. And so therefore they mandated that anyone using the surname of the presumed French father had to put otherwise known as before it. So this person wrote the letter with his last name as Brenner, but colonial officials put otherwise known as beforehand. So in 1937, Brenner wrote the following. He said, I have experienced the benefits of French civilization since my childhood, thanks to which I have a little education and a situation that allows me to live in conditions better than those in which I would live in case I had not had one or the other, referring to education. With all my heart, I am French, and my greatest desire is the right to bear the title. He ended the letter with a pledge. I promise to you, the Attorney General, to be a faithful son to France. So again, these very emotional documents, really kind of claiming the authenticity of their Frenchness in spite of French racial codes. Another letter dated 1938 comes from another person by the name of Jean Traoré, who was in Guinea, who had moved around. He was a medical professional in the French colonial service, who had moved between Guinea, Senegal, and Mali. And in his letter, he wrote, quote, I have always been a child of a state, meaning the French colonial state. All of my education and my upbringing has been paid for, and I am undoubtedly a son of France. So these constant letters. And you can see in the language that these are gendered males. Interestingly enough, one thing that Emmanuel Saada, who's a French scholar who wrote about multiracial citizenship in Indochine, wrote that the French laws gendered citizenship as male. And certainly in West Africa, it was much more men who applied for citizenship. I had records of only 3 women, or I should say girls, because they were actually minors who gained citizenship. And yet in contrast, in French Equatorial Africa, a full 50% of people who applied for and gained French citizenships were women. So we can talk through in the Q&A a little bit more about these gender dynamics. So what did French citizenship mean? Why did people actually want this status? And I can also talk a little bit about children. We're a special case. So if anyone's interested in children in this dynamic, you can ask me questions about it again in the Q&A. So to a certain extent, I get the sense that the French themselves had no idea what would happen with this law. And as we know, there are always unintended consequences. So what did French citizenship mean, and what did people want from it? And how did this change the kinds of ideas of French colonial rule? So for this, well, I'll get back to sharing some images with you. And I'm going to take us from Dakar, Saint Louis, which we've already been to, in Libreville, and to Brazzaville. So to a certain extent, Brazzaville, as many of you know, during the era of World War II, was more than just the capital city of French Equatorial Africa. For a moment, it was the capital city of Free France. Since France had no actual territory for this time period. So to a certain extent, I argue that what happened in Brazzaville during the World War II radiated out to the rest of French-speaking West Africa. To the rest of French-speaking Africa. So to a certain extent, amidst World War II, between 1939 and 1945, Brazzaville became the center of kind of defining and contestations for what French citizenship meant to multiracial peoples, and I would say became a bellwether for thinking about this new status of French citizens that was open to all people in French Africa in the aftermath of World War II. So what did citizenship mean to multiracial Africans themselves who got it? And again, Brazzaville was the center of these contestations. So even after achieving, and these are just some photos that come from Brazzaville, the 2 on the bottom are these colonial postcards, if you will, but I wanted to really turn your attention to the image on the top left, which is an image of multiracial Africans who joined Rigonneau's association that was from Dakar and founded branches throughout French-speaking Africa, so in Libreville, in Brazzaville, in Bamako, etc., in Abidjan, there became branches, and this became a trans-African organization. So these are some images. So truly, what citizenship meant for people is access to social rights. So this comes to what Misha Barton, who's a scholar of France, talks about how citizenship is not just about political rights. It's really about social rights and the rights to access to social resources. So I'll tell you, for example, the story of André Blois, who was a person who, after independence, served in the government of Patrice Lumumba, and André Blois's autobiography, and also Henri Lopez, who was the first prime minister at some point, just passed away a few months ago, of the Congo. So Henri Lopez, in his memoir, talks. So I'll start with André Blois at first. So André Blois talks in her memoir that she disavowed because she said it spent more time on her personal life as opposed to her political activism. Talks about how growing up in Brazzaville amidst World War II, she was often referred to as café au lait by Black residents of the town and experienced it as a slight, if you will. In a book of vignettes about his life history, Lopez recounts a childhood story. And he says how, with a hateful look on his face, a childhood friend shouted at him, café au lait, as a slur. Writing of this incident in his elderly years, Lopez intimates that these words hurt because his grandmother and his métis aunts of extended kin convince of themselves just as fully Congolese as anyone others, and that they did not think themselves as white. So for him, these words negated his blackness. Bla's account, narrated to an American writer in circumstances that I said, again, made her denounce the book, conveys how the boys, or the servants of white men, would solicit her when she was walking in the streets at the behest of their employers, who regarded her as a sexual object. And when she refused to engage, they would also refer to her mixed parentage as a slur. Yet when she crossed into the plateau, or the European section, she would deliberately go into white-owned shops, speaking French, and oftentimes they would respond to her in Lingala, which she viewed as a way of negating her Frenchness, and yet she was a French citizenship. She said, quote, "It was a way of saying that although we had French citizenship, we had no real rights to use French." However, she would deliberately appear again and again into these shops, and said that for us, the mere fact that they spoke to us was a victory. We had refused intimidation. So they both talk about these kind of multifaceted encounters, if you will, with both other, quote, Black residents of the city, as well as other white residents of the city. So another thing that occurred as we get to the 1950s, in which these kind of sense of decolonization was increasing in terms of cries, Métis also really solidified these kind of transnational organizations to the point where we often think about the various congresses that were held in the 1950s. In fact, there were 2 international congresses of Métis that took place, and these are some photos from the congresses that were published in a newsletter called Le Africain. So the first Congress took place in Brazzaville in the 1957, and the first image on the left is a photo of some of these people who attended the Congress, Métis members who were sitting around the table, signing these accords at the end. It was very symbolic that it was in Brazzaville, where Charles de Gaulle had held a similar Congress that was supposed to determine the future of French colonial rule without any Africans present. And again, here are some more images. And then the second Congress was held not on the African continent, but in Germany, of all places. And here's an image of some of the people who attended. And so to have Africans who are getting the backing, in spite of France, to plan a conference, or a Congress, I should say, in Germany was very significant in this time period. And indeed, what I argue that comes out of this is this concept that I'm calling Métis or multiracial internationalism. Oftentimes we talk about Black internationalism as being a way of thought for kind of mobilizing around rights and access and independence and world making in this time period. But I argue that multiracial internationalism is also a concept, this idea that being multiracial in and of itself was a form of family, a form of identity, a form of community, and a legal status around which to form the particular worlds. So to conclude, so to a certain extent, I thought the story was over and kind of in the 1960s. And part of the reason why it ends is that as in French-speaking Africa, as countries gain independence between 1960 and 1963 or so, en masse really in 1960, one by one, they sign accords that anyone who had not had French citizenship before the ending of colonialism could have no access to it. And so therefore, this ended the story. However, during the COVID, something occurred that in fact has told me that the story is to be continued, and it will continue in this way. So in 2020, July of 2020, as most of the world sat in COVID lockdowns, and indeed in French, there was a documentary that appeared on French television. It had been filmed in the Ivory Coast before the lockdowns. And the film is this image on the bottom right, and it's called in French, Les Enfants Cachés de la France Coloniale, or the hidden children of French colonialism or colonial France. And this story about kind of multiracial people and their attempts by the French to erase them came about because this man on the right hand side, whose name, just look at my notes and I can't find it here, but he wrote a book about the orphanage that the French had founded in Bingerville, in close to Abidjan. So as a result of his writing this book is where the story came up again. But in the documentary, older Métis, such as this man at the bottom who is in a wheelchair, announced that they were suing the French government. One of them had a child who was a lawyer, and they're suing the French government for recognition, for the right to paternity, potentially inheritance rights from their fathers. And so the person who was the lawyer on the documentary actually said something very fascinating, because she said to a certain extent, they should be able to prove parentage because there should be birth certificates or documents that exist talking about parentage. But as I told you, the French were very clear to constantly scrub records of these records. So the lawyer said the following. So in theory, we should have access to French citizenship and access to rights. Being the holder of a right is one thing, she stated, but to exercise the right, one needs documentary evidence, and the onus is on the claimant to provide the burden of proof for paternity. So what does this mean, and why does the story continue in the 21st century? So as we know, across the kind of, since COVID, there have been ideas about reckoning, if you will, for colonial rule. And that's come about through things such as the restitution of art that has been sitting in European and Western museums. Across French-speaking Africa, within the past few months, there have been coups that have upended the French and American appointed governments from Niger to Mali and so on. So there's this idea, if you will, of a reckoning and of creating societies in the ways that Africans would want them. So I too argue that the idea of multiracial identities and this kind of reckoning, the story continues into the 21st century, and it will continue in terms of a documentary that I'll be filming and working with some Senegalese peoples and using the very dubious technologies of 23andMe and DNA to trace their kind of multi-country kinship networks across Mali, Senegal, Benin, and perhaps also in France. So my work, I think, recounts the overlooked and yet important history of how multiracial people in 20th century and 21st century West Africa thought of their own identities. And in doing so, it's a story of race and Africa, and also race and Africa, how African identities go beyond these kind of, again, binaries to really think about the full geopolitical, cultural, and racial borders. It is argued by Henri Lopez, the writer that I referred to, Africa, quote, is not a race. Further, he argues for the need to have, again, these more multiple and capacious stories. So often I think that while the people and stories continue to be swept under the rug and subsumed under neoliberal policymaking, continued debates about post-colonial detritus and post-colonial reckoning, these claims will not be silenced, and these stories about how to define family, self, legal status continue into the 21st century. Thank you.
Oh, Michelle, that's great. Mango, do you want to? Oh, okay. Do you want to do the Q&A here?
Yes, and I'm so sorry that I can't see people.
Well, we can. Well, we will let people have the option to ask questions. So, If there are questions right now, you can either put them in the Q&A or raise your hand. But Rochelle, I did actually have one question for you, and that is, you mentioned a lot that it was the Frenchmen and African women, and then the children are the product of that. I know a lot of people who have the opposite parentage, and I'm just wondering if that's a more recent phenomena, and if you did find anybody who had French mothers and African fathers in that work that you were doing there, and if that
Yes.
made a difference in how they were in the world.
It absolutely made a difference. So the Métis that I'm speaking about are those who were the children of African women and European men. And their particular theme or contestation, if you would, was the very fact that these marriages were not, quote, legitimate marriages before French colonial law that made them have the status of illegitimacy and therefore a lack of rights. But as we know, in the 1940s and 1950s, there are people like Léopold Senghor, Houphouët-Boigny. You can think about many of the kind of independence political activists, in fact, had legal French wives, and those children had a very different status, very, very different status, because oftentimes these men also were themselves French citizens. And so there was not the sense of a fight or a struggle for legitimacy, if you would. And so this is a story of the lack of, quote, legal parentage and how the French wanted to erase, and I would say maintain, the kind of fiction about the boundaries of colonialism, and also not give access to resources and therefore sully and open up the window of claims. But then the really fascinating thing is, again, the story that I thought was done in 1963. Here we are in 2024, and this has an afterlife, if you will, around this moment of colonial reckoning, around these ideas of kind of picking up the detritus of colonial rule and making claims, and also around new possibilities and new technologies of DNA technologies and what that would enter. And also as more and more documents become declassified in the colonial records, there's also a sense of stories that are being uncovered.
And maybe with the new elections in France, this could all upend everything in terms of nationalism. What all that means in terms of what France may or may not want to have a conversation about. Are there other questions? Raise. All right, Xavier, would you like to ask your question? You can actually voice your question.
I see the question. So can everyone see the question? I can read it out loud, I guess. So the question is, can you please tell us what triggered your interest in métissage and how this multiracial identity interplays with contemporary Pan-Africanism? A really great question. So I guess in terms of how this interest came about, so my first book was about marriage in Gabon. And I had just one very small chapter on interracial sexuality, or what French referred to mariage à la mode du pays, marriage according to the rights of the country, or as Gabonese referred to them as just marriages. So in Libreville, because it was a port city, there was a phenomena of interracial sexual unions, interracial marriages, by a particular ethno-language group. And because this was just one chapter of the book, what really started once that was finished is, well, what happened to the children? Because there was the sense for the French that these children would just disappear. Because again, they had this kind of, you're either Black or white citizen or indigène. And so they just wanted them to not claim this third identity. Yet I got the sense from the Gabon that there was this constant sense that we are Métis, and Métis is a separate identity. And it was as a result of just doing some archival research in Senegal that I discovered that this was not just a Gabon alone phenomena. In fact, throughout French Africa, French-speaking Africa, what I found is that in every colony, an independent association of Métis had began in the 1930s and 1940s. And then by the time we get to the 1940s, 1950s, there's this Pan-African, and I'll use that term, organization that exists, called at first the Union of Euro-Africans of French West Africa, that later becomes, the name is the Union of Euro-Africans of what they call Black Africa. So this idea of multiracial identity interplays with Pan-Africanism. I conceptualize the term of multiracial internationalism. And to a certain extent, one of the things that I argue again, so this at the root of Pan-Africanism is this idea of kind of Black identity as being the kind of uniform identity for Africa. And it comes through things like negritude and so on. And while there is also this kind of Arab and Black cross working, if you will, and in an era of Congresses, there's still this kind of unified identity that racial identity in Africa means this. So to a certain extent, I use the term multiracial internationalism in direct and very deliberate interplay with Pan-Africanism and as well as Black internationalism to think about multiraciality as an identity, or if you will, a platform through which multiracial Africans are also arguing for access to rights against the kind of inequities of colonial rule. And this idea that they're going to shape a world in which they have greater access to resources and greater say in what's occurring. So just the one more thing that I'll say is this was an anti-colonial movement, the multiracial internationalism, in that they wanted greater equality within colonial rule, but we're not per se explicitly asking for the dismantling of colonial rule. So in some ways, it mirrors the thought of many of the first kind of French-speaking West African political activists.
Other questions?
Okay, so oh my gosh, they're coming fast and fiercely. Okay.
All right. So let me hold on here. All right. Valerie, Dr. Beloved, go ahead.
Okay, my slides. I think my slides are no longer
right. You know, your slides are no longer up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to sit with this for a moment. Well, actually, thank you for this. This was absolutely wonderful to hear that the nuances of how being and belonging really does engage citizenship practices, the work that I call citizenship practices and practices. And I appreciate that you're focusing on the social dimension of citizenship practices. Can you speak to where there might have been some how can I say, emanations of certain kinds of citizenship practices? One of them, for example, holding property, or who could hold property, and the notion of having to make decisions as to whether am I going to be am I going to choose to be such and such, because I don't speak French. I'm more on the Arabic side, so I don't even try, okay? So if the words are, if the practices required you to make certain kinds of choices so that you could be in those social realms, and I don't know if they were necessarily gendered. They might have been just gendered, but I'm curious. I have a feeling they're not always gendered. Thank you for that.
Yes. So that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought up the question of property, because that was certainly one of the primary contestations, if you will, that all of these Métis associations for Métis, excuse me, who were citizens were definitely fighting the French for. So first, property and gender. So here's something really fascinating, and this was much more of a Libreville context and not so much elsewhere in different colonies, if you will. So in Gabon, and then this actually goes with the question that Eric Schmidt is asking next about ethnicity. Okay, so property is that, so in Libreville specifically, and then I would also say also in what was known at the time as Ubangi Chari, there is the sense that women would in fact gain some measure of wealth sometimes from these relationships that would allow them to therefore have greater access to resources and therefore to particular social standing. So in Libreville, for example, not often, I just say there are moments, and it's hard to quantify these things because again, the records are kind of diffuse, so I can't, it's hard to quantify. So I will just say there were instantiations of women who had been involved in interracial relationships who, when the European man left, they inherited or they gained property ownership of the cement house that the European men had built. And so one thing that would occur in Libreville in the 1940s and 1950s is that women who were often of the Mpongwe ethnicity, there was one particular ethnic group in Gabon that would engage in interracial relationships, were property owners. Whereas you would see very few women of other ethno-language groups in Gabon being property owners. And this idea, I remember as one person who was in her 90s, when I spoke with her in her early 2000s, was saying, we women, we Métis women kind of commanded here because we had property. We were property owners and therefore we were taxpayers, and we were also literate, having attended mission schools. And so there's an instance of a big tax revolt that takes place amidst World War I in Libreville, in which it is primarily multiracial women who were at the head of the protests, deposing the demands for the city's populations. In Ubangi Chari in particular, there's a case that an article that I'm actually working on now, where sometimes women would gain cattle that their European husbands, if you will, would leave a herd of cattle for them. And therefore that would also constitute some source of wealth that they could use to therefore raise their children or have their own wealth. However, I don't want to say that these instantiations in any way kind of negate the vast majority of fathers who did not take care of their children whatsoever. And then the other thing about property in Congo and Gabon, and also in Ubangi Chari, where there was lots of felling of wood, timber, for example, was a primary industry. Colonial laws said very explicitly that Africans could not own land, and yet Métis kept arguing because that they were citizens, the ones who were citizens, that they should have the same rights as white French citizens. And so the French still had this distinction between a Métis citizen and white citizen, and the right to have access to get a permit to be able to cut and sell timber was a constant battle and contestation. To a certain extent, the Métis organization in Gabon and Congo did succeed in actually gaining those rights from there. But I also want to point a caveat that oftentimes Métis would ask for rights to the detriment of, let's say, Black Congolese, in terms of saying that we do have this privilege, not because we're the children of Frenchmen, but because our racial makeup makes us more superior. So there is also this kind of racist language that some Métis themselves are using. And in terms of thinking about Eric's question about ethnicity in relation to race is a really important question, depending on where in Equatorial or French West Africa that my study is from. And so one of the things that I argue is that these kind of racial logics, racial thought, racial identities were not dependent upon the French context, but rather the diversity of local, social, cultural, and linguistic contexts. So I'll answer your question, Eric, by using Senegal and then Gabon as case studies, because this book also took me from Senegal to Cote d'Ivoire to Congo, just in places where I never thought I would be, as I was following the kind of roots of all the various historical actors. So in a place like Senegal, where the women involved in relationships were varied ethno-language groups, it wasn't just one particular ethnic group. The battle, if you will, for contestations for rights for Métis children were often couched within the umbrella of access to social rights for African children, no matter what their origins. So Duguay Clédor, the person that I talked about at the beginning, who was a former mayor of Saint-Louis, was asked, and he himself was not Métis, and yet he was asking the Senegalese colonial state to give rights to access to education and social resources to Métis children, because if the French didn't even care for the children with French blood in their veins, how would they therefore provide access to education to all children in Senegal, as promised with the colonial mission? So for the most part in Senegal, again, the access to rights was couched within the kind of umbrella of access to rights that all Africans should have. And you can see this where, for example, at the time we have territorial assemblies in each capital city where Africans are being elected to them and are voting on local budgets, where there are Black Senegalese senators who are voting for funding for the schooling of Métis children. However, in contrast, in Gabon, where it is one particular ethno-language group for the most part that is engaging in interracial sex. And they use this as something to differentiate themselves. They intermarry. They think of themselves as better than. And in fact, I remember one time in Libreville, I was walking through the neighborhood trying to find someone, and I kept saying, I'm looking for the home of this Métis person. And people kept looking at me like, we don't know who you're talking about. But at some point, someone said to me, oh, La Blanche, the white woman. Why didn't you say you were looking for the white woman? Then all of a sudden they knew who I was talking about. But that points to how it's the ways in which this particular ethno-language group used the sense of difference and betterment that made for a very different context. So if anything, I argue again for the particularities of local context and whatever local contestations that are going on that really fuel what multiracial thought and identities look like.
So we have another question from Janshi Jin. And again, well, if you want to say the question, Anchi, you can.
Okay.
You want to read it out?
So, you know, this Anji, do you want to speak, or should I just read out the question? I guess I'll just read it out. Okay. So the question is, could you please share your thoughts for multiracial individuals in Africa? Does personal self-identification hold greater significance, or does legal recognition carry more weight in shaping their identity? So this is an it depends question. So my research covered the period of colonial rule, so for like the early 20th century when it became more formalized, to about 1963 when these accords are placed on the books. And I would say that it also depends on local contexts. Since I looked across a really wide area in French West and French Equatorial Africa. So I'll use, for example, some Senegal as a case point, and then Nicolas Rigonneau, which was one of the people that I talked about. He was the person in one of the photos next to his mother, and also who founded the Organization of Euro-Africans. And he was a pretty extraordinary person in that he wrote a lot of documents, published a newsletter, would crisscross between Brazzaville, Dakar, et cetera, and left behind a lot of records. So as we get to the 1950s, where he had access to travel like this, he would often write about how entering back into Senegal, or let's say even after independence in 1960, 1961, that oftentimes when he was at the airport, for example, he writes these stories about how guards would bribe him for money in the same way and in the same amounts that they would ask white people and Europeans. And he felt very offended by that because it was always a slight that somehow he was not Senegalese. He was less than Senegalese because even though he had the Senegalese passport, the other people would kind of be able to go. And there was this constant kind of questioning of his identity as Senegalese because he was Métis, precisely because he was multiracial. So for him, it was both important for fellow Senegalese people to acknowledge the identity that he wanted, that he ascribed to himself as, I am Métis, I am Euro-African, and that is kind of a separate identity. But he didn't say it made him better, but it was just something that should be recognized. And so as you read a lot of his speeches, he would argue constantly that both Black Senegalese and white Frenchmen or Germans, Europeans are also racist. He would argue against multiracial people in not recognizing their own form of self-identity. So I think that someone like Rigonneau would argue that both were important. The self-identification and the ways in which their kin groups, their maternal kin, would recognize it, as well as the French would recognize these identities. And in the French recognition identities came the legal recognition of Frenchness or French citizenship. So another example that I'll give you is the man who was in the wheelchair, the photo that I showed you in that documentary that came out in 2020 or 2021, who has since then passed away. There's a scene in that documentary where he's talking in front of his grandchildren, talking about his mother and the relationship that she had with the Frenchman. And he's crying at some point because for him, he had never talked about this history. The children and grandchildren knew obviously that he didn't look like them to a certain extent, but he had never actually spoke the story. And so there's a way in which him being able to speak the story is a way of kind of saying to his family, and I also have a French father, and that is also part of me, and I've kept that hidden and I haven't really talked about it. And legal recognition is also important because this organization is now, again, suing the French government. So I think it continues to be a both and.
Maybe if there's one last question, we can do that. Otherwise, we might want to take a short break before the next. Oh, Ivy Mills, Ivy, please go ahead.
Hi,
Hi,
Rochelle.
Ivy.
Thank you so much for
Hi,
this talk.
Ivy.
Hi, Martha. Hi,
Hi.
everybody. I just picked my son up from camp, so I may have missed a little bit. But I wanted to know if in Senegal there was any big difference between the descendants of the Seigneur, you know, the sort of very old Métis families, and then the sort of the newer Métis children who were maybe born in the 1930s, 1940s, in the latter part of the colonial period.
Yes, that's a great question. And this makes me think about the book of Hilary Jones, for example. And there is an absolute difference that Senegalese scholars, as well as when I'm reading documents from Métis who were born after the consolidation of colonialism, would often talk about people born after the consolidation of colonialism as Métis de la deuxième génération, Métis of the second generation. And seigneurs and Métis descending from seigneurs is a very different legal status. And there's a hard legal status difference and also more of a moral and social status. So oftentimes the descendants of seigneurs are French citizens, and they're French citizens by virtue of where they were born, which was often Saint-Louis, Rufisque, Dakar, places referred to as the four communes in Senegal, where people, whatever their racial background, born in these four places were French citizens. However, Métis born after the consolidation of colonial rule, many of whom who were not born in Dakar or the four communes, because as you follow the kind of travels, if you will, of European soldiers, merchants, adventurers who were in the colonies are often born in rural areas, did not have the citizenship status. So they don't see themselves as the same people, because Métis descended from seigneurs, that even though Hilary Jones argues that they lost their kind of political elite status, they still had a particular economic status and perhaps more of a cultural status. And there was no search for French citizenship for them because they were French citizens. And yet those born after the consolidation of colonial rule constantly had this battle for decades to come that I chronicle, in that they were searching for a kind of moral and social legitimacy also. Nicolas Rigonneau talks about a sense of shame that people often felt in that their fathers had not recognized them, and also a sense of legal legitimacy in that the French state just refused to often to acknowledge their legal status and also give them access to their resources. So they're definitely very, very, very different groups who see themselves differently. And that goes to the question also about the children of, let's say, African men and European women also having different identities. So, and one reason why I call this book Multiracial Identities as opposed to Multiracial Identity is that there is no singular multiracial identity. Rather, there are multiple conceptions of self that exist. And again, this is why I think there's more work to be done in terms of thinking about racial thought within the African continent, and how race in Africa contributes to our understanding of global ideas about Blackness, whiteness, otherness, and also how culture, biology, and also individual and collective senses of self tell us how these processes of racialization and how they occur.
Well, that is a profound note to maybe finish on here. I think it just, there's an incredible amount of just work to be done in that area. And I appreciate that you're making this contribution, Rochelle. It is wonderful again. And that you're still here within the Bay Area community. And I do hope that I've put the book into both the chat and the Q&A, and that people look at it and maybe reach out to you again to have further conversations about this in other forum. So at this.
Thank you for viewing this recording. We hope you enjoyed the talk by Rochelle. Visit the Center for African Studies at africa.berkeley.edu and WARA at westafricanresearchassociation.org. Thank you and have a lovely day.